Hello and welcome to the NAF Professional Ethics course. I'm Mr. Lewis and I will be the one guiding you throughout this entire first lesson. The course is called Professional Ethics. It is a multi-pathway course with NAF. Professional ethics provides a solid understanding of why ethics is essential in every profession. After an introduction to several philosophies that inform ethics today, you will explore the characteristics of an ethical professional. You will consider the range of dilemmas faced by managers and employees in the workplace and discover the qualities of influential leaders and the tools modern professionals use to instill an ethical workplace culture. Throughout the course, you will have opportunities to refine your personal sense of ethics as they begin to build an ethical foundation for your professional future. NAF Professional Ethics Lesson 1, Course Introduction. This introductory lesson exposes you to some of the key terms and areas of knowledge that you will be studying throughout this course. After an exercise to create a trustworthy classroom environment, you will explore what you currently value. You will then establish a basic understanding of ethical theories and see how these theories are relevant to ethical dilemmas we face today. You will acquire a sense of the course objectives by looking at an example of a culminating project. You will also set up two course tools, a general taxonomy of key ethics terms, and a notebook that you will use throughout the course. This is Unit 1 and Lesson 1 of Professional Ethics, which will be entirely 4 units and 12 lessons. Lesson framework, learning objectives. So by the end of this lesson, you will infer the skills and knowledge about ethics needed to be successful in an authentic project, identify general ethics terms with which to build a taxonomy, display understanding of ethical concepts that form the basis of ethics in industry, interpret current ethical dilemmas according to different ethical philosophies, evaluate whether people are more motivated by self-interest or by moral and ethical considerations. This is one of the displaying understanding of ethical concepts that form the basis of ethics in industry is one of the 16 learning objectives assessed by the NAF Track certification end of course exam for this course. Introduction, getting to know and trust you. Because the professional ethics course requires a lot of participation, discussion, and sharing of ideas and opinions, it is important for class members to work together as a group and feel comfortable sharing their thoughts. Take 1 minute to think of something about yourselves that many people might not know, even people who you hang out with at school. This can be anything, but it must be true, it must be easy to remember, and it must be something that you feel comfortable sharing with the class. No confessional tell-alls or too much information stories. After the minute is up, you will be sharing your fact, and every other person who follows thereafter will share his or her own fact, as well as the facts of those who have already spoken. If you're in my class, you have this worksheet that you will be filling out. It is exactly what was described in the previous slide. However, you will be writing it down. What is something about yourself that many people might not know, even people who you hang out with at school? Okay, so once you have finished that activity, we're moving on to the next activity called categorizing. What matters to me? This activity will encourage you to start thinking about what matters most to you. You will then speculate on how your personal values might be connected with this course. Follow these instructions. Fold a piece of paper lengthwise into 3 sections. Label the first column, what matters most to me, and the middle column, why, and leave the third column blank. Under the what matters column, create a list of things that are important to you. It can be possessions and other tangible items. It could be people, ideas, beliefs, experiences, etc. List one item per line, skipping one line between each item. For each item you list, briefly explain its importance to you in the why column. Once again, if you're in class with me, you will be filling out your information on this worksheet, which already has the 3 columns. The first column, what matters most to me. The second column, why, and that third blank column. So you will be filling it out in this worksheet here. So right now, I will allow you several minutes to write. Afterwards, you will categorize your items in the blank column. So once you are finished, you will categorize all of those items about what matters most to you in the blank column. The categories might be possessions, things you own, people, places, memories, beliefs, or ideas. After you have finished your list and categories, I will then explain the difference between tangible and intangible. So going back to the worksheet, when you put what matters most to you and why, in that third blank column, you will categorize it as whether these are possessions, what matters most to you is a person, place, a memory, a belief, or an idea. And that's what you will be categorizing in that third column. Here are some definitions that you should know. Tangible means something that you can touch, like a pen or a tree. Something that is intangible is something that you cannot touch because it does not have a physical presence. For example, a dream or a value. Take a moment and think of some examples of both tangible and intangible objects. Once again, if you have class with me, you will actually be filling this part out in this next worksheet. You will be writing down tangible items in the tangible side of the paper, and on the other side you'll be listing the intangible items, objects that you cannot touch. Now that you have finished categorizing and identifying both tangible and intangible items, take a few minutes to respond to the following questions. Were there more tangible items like personal possessions on your list, or more intangible ones like memories or beliefs? What do you think would matter the most to you if all of the tangible items were eliminated from your list? Businesses care about intangible items too. And one of the purposes of this course is to examine what matters in the professional world. Write down one intangible thing you think might matter to an organization that interests you, and explain why it would matter. When you are finished with these questions, I will call on some of you to share your responses. Once again, if you have class with me, you have this worksheet to fill out. So first question you'll be answering in this first box is, were there more intangible items like personal possessions on your list, or more intangible ones like memories or beliefs? The second one you'll answer is, what do you think would matter most to you if all of the tangible items were eliminated from your list? And then the third one is about intangible items and one intangible thing you think might matter to an organization that interests you. Once you have finished doing that, we are moving on to the presentation, an example of the culminating project which you must do in order to receive your NAF track certification. This activity will familiarize you with the culminating project that you will be creating at the end of the course. It also focuses on the following college and career skill: developing awareness of one's own abilities and performance. The driving question for the culminating project is, what is a serious ethical issue currently facing our industry? You will work in groups to research the ethics-related issues that your industry is grappling with and choose one that you feel is important to resolve. You will use what you learn in this course to make this decision and propose the most effective ways to resolve or mitigate the issue. You will then present your findings in a panel discussion or ethics bowl format. We can vote on this in class. I am going to show you an animated version of a presentation to give you a sense of what your final presentation will entail. This animation is just an example to catch your attention. For your actual project, you will be participating in a live panel presentation or an ethics bowl. As you view this video, you should focus on what the students are saying rather than how the animation is put together. View the presentation so you can get an overall sense of the presentation. Focus on the following question. What do you think you need to know about ethics, and what skills would you need to have in order to participate in a panel discussion or ethics bowl? Write down your answers to this question as you view the example and for a few minutes afterwards. Once again, if you are in class with me, you have this worksheet in front of you. And for this first viewing of the video, you're going to be answering the first question. What do you think you need to know about ethics, and what skills would you need to have in order to participate in a panel presentation or ethics bowl? You'll be filling out number 1 as you watch the video. And here's the video.
In 2012, a young man shot and killed 26 people at Sandy Hook Elementary School. He played a lot of video games, including violent ones. In 1999, 2 seniors killed 12 people and injured 21 others at Columbine High School. They also played violent video games. And in 2013, a 15-year-old boy in New Mexico murdered his parents and 3 of his siblings. He played violent video games too.
It's easy to say that there is a link between violent behavior and playing violent video games, but does the research prove it? Yes, many studies have found all kinds of negative effects when people under the age of 18 play violent video games. These games do influence the attitudes and behaviors of the people who play them. Today we will address an important ethical issue in the gaming industry. Using both research and personal experience, we argue that one of the most pressing ethical problems is the marketing of violent video games to players under the age of 18. We will answer the question, is it unethical for video game makers to choose profit over the mental health of young people and ultimately over the health of our society?
The industry will say that it's not their problem because violent video games aren't made for kids. They're made for adults. But based on our observations, the industry does market to kids. We see commercials for M-rated games on TV all the time. For example, when we watch shows for adults like The Walking Dead or South Park. But they're also advertised on shows for kids like Teen Wolf on MTV. And if you buy an E-rated game, which means it's okay for any age to play, it often comes with ads for violent games.
To answer our question, we use the ethical decision-making framework. The first step is to figure out what the problem is. Do a lot of kids and teens play these games, and is it bad for them? Games with an M rating, meaning for a mature audience, are by far the most popular games. We learned that 2/3 of boys aged 12 to 14 regularly play M-rated games. We have seen our younger brothers or cousins play them, even if their parents say they aren't allowed to.
Movies show violence, and music can have violent lyrics. The difference with games is that you are pretending to commit violent acts yourself. You watch as you shoot someone in the game, and they scream and blood squirts out. It's realistic and gory. In games like Grand Theft Auto, you get points for killing innocent people and cops. This is like saying you're doing a good job when you hurt and kill people. To kids, that is the message.
The second step in the ethics framework is to examine the facts and opinions. Some researchers point out that teen violence has gone down recently, but most research shows that playing violent video games has a negative impact on children and teens.
For instance, playing violent video games is a better predictor of whether someone is going to commit a crime than if they do drugs. The statistics say that teens who spend a lot of time playing violent video games are more impulsive and more aggressive than teens who don't. They are more likely to do risky things like drink or do drugs. They also have a higher rate of depression.
We've noticed that we're more likely to snap at someone or get into an argument if we've been gaming for a while. This might not seem like a big deal, but what happens when everyone's walking around ready to argue or fight? What about the victims of this aggression?
Step 3 of the framework asks, so what are the other choices? We could pass bans on these kinds of games, but doesn't that break freedom of speech? If Bradley Cooper can star in American Sniper, why can't a company make a video game about being a sniper? We could punish stores that sell M-rated games to minors, but most stores already don't do that.
We could punish parents who let their kids play these kinds of games, but how could that be enforced? We can't stop parents from letting their child take a sip of beer or from showing them an R-rated movie. Plus, none of these solutions deal with the real issue, which is the ethics of the industry itself.
We have a three-pronged solution for this problem. The first is for the gaming industry to make more and better socially responsible games. Instead of creating games that teach violence, companies can create games that reward kids for playing fair or accomplishing something really cool. They can make more appealing games that teach people to make good choices and do constructive things.
While some violent games would still be on the market for adults, we also think the most violent acts in video games should be banned. Things like murdering children or mass murder. The industry should use an ethical framework, just like we are, to decide if a game's scenarios are okay or not.
The industry also shouldn't market to kids. We can use regulations to prevent video game makers from using TV commercials. Cigarettes can't be advertised on TV, so why should violent video games? Instead, they can advertise in gaming magazines and other places that are just for adults, or in other M-rated games. The next step in the ethics framework is to test our decision using 3 criteria: reversibility, publicity, and harm. With reversibility, we ask, would we think this was a good policy if we were affected by it? Our answer is yes. If we were video game makers, we think it was a good idea to use an ethical framework in creating our games. In fact, we think that it's too easy and not very creative to just make violent games. Marketers could pitch these more creative games as a draw to bring new gamers into the market.
For the ethics framework publicity test, we think the industry could advertise their new policies through emails, Facebook, and Twitter. And at conventions for game makers, the Entertainment Software Rating Board could be involved or even responsible for making everyone aware of these changes.
The last question is about harm. We think this decision does the least amount of harm to all parties. Kids can still play video games, but their psychological well-being is protected. Game developers still make a profit. They might make a little less than with violent video games, but the mental health of kids and teens is more important than the bigger profit margin.
The final step in the ethics framework is to evaluate the outcome of our decision. Obviously, we don't know if our solutions will be successful because the video game industry isn't using them. Not yet, anyway.
We can say that our solutions respect the interest of all stakeholders. Kids and teens can play fun, creative video games. Parents are supported when they try to prevent their kids from playing violent video games. Game makers still make a profit, but they are contributing to a better society. They are protecting the psychological well-being of kids and playing a more positive role in kids' social development.
Welcome back. Let's move on. I'm going to show you the video again. This time, you will be looking for the skills and knowledge that you will need to learn in this course in order to produce a successful culminating project. You'll be scrolling down to the bottom half of the page and you'll be answering what skills will you need to learn in this course in order to produce a successful culminating project. And here's the video a second time, this time focusing on the second question.
In 2012, a young man shot and killed 26 people at Sandy Hook Elementary School. He played a lot of video games, including violent ones. In 1999, 2 seniors killed 12 people and injured 21 others at Columbine High School. They also played violent video games. And in 2013, a 15-year-old boy in New Mexico murdered his parents and 3 of his siblings. He played violent video games too.
It's easy to say that there is a link between violent behavior and playing violent video games, but does the research prove it? Yes, many studies have found all kinds of negative effects when people under the age of 18 play violent video games. These games do influence the attitudes and behaviors of the people who play them. Today we will address an important ethical issue in the gaming industry. Using both research and personal experience, we argue that one of the most pressing ethical problems is the marketing of violent video games to players under the age of 18. We will answer the question, is it unethical for video game makers to choose profit over the mental health of young people and ultimately over the health of our society?
The industry will say that it's not their problem because violent video games aren't made for kids. They're made for adults. But based on our observations, the industry does market to kids. We see commercials for M-rated games on TV all the time. For example, when we watch shows for adults like The Walking Dead or South Park. But they're also advertised on shows for kids like Teen Wolf on MTV. And if you buy an E-rated game, which means it's okay for any age to play, it often comes with ads for violent games.
To answer our question, we use the ethical decision-making framework. The first step is to figure out what the problem is. Do a lot of kids and teens play these games, and is it bad for them? Games with an M rating, meaning for a mature audience, are by far the most popular games. We learned that 2/3 of boys aged 12 to 14 regularly play M-rated games. We have seen our younger brothers or cousins play them, even if their parents say they aren't allowed to.
Movies show violence, and music can have violent lyrics. The difference with games is that you are pretending to commit violent acts yourself. You watch as you shoot someone in the game, and they scream and blood squirts out. It's realistic and gory. In games like Grand Theft Auto, you get points for killing innocent people and cops. This is like saying you're doing a good job when you hurt and kill people. To kids, that is the message.
The second step in the ethics framework is to examine the facts and opinions. Some researchers point out that teen violence has gone down recently, but most research shows that playing violent video games has a negative impact on children and teens.
For instance, playing violent video games is a better predictor of whether someone is going to commit a crime than if they do drugs. The statistics say that teens who spend a lot of time playing violent video games are more impulsive and more aggressive than teens who don't. They are more likely to do risky things like drink or do drugs. They also have a higher rate of depression.
We've noticed that we're more likely to snap at someone or get into an argument if we've been gaming for a while. This might not seem like a big deal, but what happens when everyone's walking around ready to argue or fight? What about the victims of this aggression?
Step 3 of the framework asks, so what are the other choices? We could pass bans on these kinds of games, but doesn't that break freedom of speech? If Bradley Cooper can star in American Sniper, why can't a company make a video game about being a sniper? We could punish stores that sell M-rated games to minors, but most stores already don't do that.
We could punish parents who let their kids play these kinds of games, but how could that be enforced? We can't stop parents from letting their child take a sip of beer or from showing them an R-rated movie. Plus, none of these solutions deal with the real issue, which is the ethics of the industry itself.
We have a 3-pronged solution for this problem. The first is for the gaming industry to make more and better socially responsible games. Instead of creating games that teach violence, companies can create games that reward kids for playing fair or accomplishing something really cool. They can make more appealing games that teach people to make good choices and do constructive things.
While some violent games would still be on the market for adults, we also think the most violent acts in video games should be banned. Things like murdering children or mass murder. The industry should use an ethical framework, just like we are, to decide if a game's scenarios are okay or not.
The industry also shouldn't market to kids. We can use regulations to prevent video game makers from using TV commercials. Cigarettes can't be advertised on TV, so why should violent video games? Instead, they can advertise in gaming magazines and other places that are just for adults, or in other M-rated games. The next step in the ethics framework is to test our decision using 3 criteria: reversibility, publicity, and harm. With reversibility, we ask, would we think this was a good policy if we were affected by it? Our answer is yes. If we were video game makers, we think it was a good idea to use an ethical framework in creating our games. In fact, we think that it's too easy and not very creative to just make violent games. Marketers could pitch these more creative games as a draw to bring new gamers into the market.
For the ethics framework publicity test, we think the industry could advertise their new policies through emails, Facebook, and Twitter, and at conventions for game makers. The Entertainment Software Rating Board could be involved or even responsible for making everyone aware of these changes.
The last question is about harm. We think this decision does the least amount of harm to all parties. Kids can still play video games, but their psychological well-being is protected. Game developers still make a profit. They might make a little less than with violent video games, but the mental health of kids and teens is more important than the bigger profit margin.
The final step in the ethics framework is to evaluate the outcome of our decision. Obviously, we don't know if our solutions will be successful because the video game industry isn't using them. Not yet, anyway.
We can say that our solutions respect the interest of all stakeholders. Kids and teens can play fun, creative video games. Parents are supported when they try to prevent their kids from playing violent video games. Game makers still make a profit, but they are contributing to a better society. They are protecting the psychological well-being of kids and playing a more positive role in kids' social development.
Welcome back, and let's move on. Pair up with a neighbor to discuss your answers to the question. In class, I will ask for volunteers to share what they wrote and then list their ideas on the board. We will make two lists, one for the kinds of knowledge and one for the skills needed. As we are going through this together, you have this worksheet that you will be filling out. So as we get responses from other people in the class, you will be filling out the kinds of knowledge needed for the culminating project and the kinds of skills needed for the culminating project. And you'll be filling it out on this worksheet. Once we are finished with those two lists, we will now work together to whittle down the list to 10 or so most important skills and or areas of knowledge that you believe would be needed for this course. Explain your reasons for including each skill or knowledge area. Some suggestions could include strong oral skills, strong listening skills, or logic. Once we are done with that, and we now have our 10 most important pieces of knowledge or skills to finish this course and successfully complete the culminating project, let us now move on to the course notebook. You will be required to keep a notebook with your work for this course. Your notebook is a place where you will save important work. You will need to bring your notebook to every class, and you will use it to keep many kinds of work in, including notes you take on readings and lectures, assignments and associated resources, reflections, and project plans specifically for that culminating project. Your notebook provides you with the following. It is an orderly way of keeping notes, reflections, project work, and so forth for each lesson so that you can reference your work when necessary. It provides you with a place to insert student resource pages such as reference sheets, note-taking tools, graphic organizers, and other materials that you complete during each lesson. It also provides you with a means of setting up a table of contents that you can find a page when you need it. When you are clear on how to set up your notebook and have created a table of contents, you will now have a place to put your first assignment for this course, which you will learn about next. You have this worksheet, which you will fill in as we are keeping out. If you're in class with me, you'll be keeping your notebook in OneDrive. So you will fill out the date, the topic, the lesson number. Recall, this is lesson number 1, and the file name that you saved in your OneDrive account. So now on to the first major assignment. Reading response assignment. You are going to learn how to complete your first assignment for this course, which is to write thoughtful responses to a reading on key concepts in ethics. First, take a look at and read Student Resource 1.1, Response, Key Concepts in Ethics. This writing assignment will help you to understand the ideas that form the foundation for exploring ethics in this course. It will also familiarize you with the vocabulary specific to the subject of ethics. If you are in my classroom, you have this Student Resource 1.1 Response Key Concepts in Ethics in front of you, and you will be responding to the questions in each section below after you read that section of Student Resource 1.2, Reading Key Concepts in Ethics. So you'll be reading and then you'll be responding to what you've read. Before you write your response, you will have a chance to discuss each section with your classmates and clear up any confusion. Before beginning, be sure to read the assessment criteria at the end of this resource to understand how your work will be assessed, and we will be reviewing that. And so you can see how there's a section, and then there are questions, and there are 4 sections in total, and 4 questions for each of those sections. Before we proceed, do you have any questions? If so, be sure you ask those questions in class before we move on. Let's now take a look at the assessment criteria at the end of this resource. This assignment will be graded. And these are the criteria by which the teacher will assess your work. Once you look at it, remember to ask any questions. And if you have any questions, make a note of it, any questions so you can ask your teacher in class. These are your assessment criteria. The first criterion is that the response indicates a careful reading of the excerpt by citing part of it or referring to it. Your second is that your response must provide examples or reasoning according to the pertinent ethical theory. Third, your response should demonstrate an understanding of the differences between the theories. And fourth, the response is written in complete sentences using proper spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So right now we are going to move on to the first reading assignment, Plato and the Ring of Gyges. The Greek philosopher Plato wrote a story called The Ring of Gyges. In his book, The Republic, Book 2, here is the basic plot line and Plato's thoughts about this story. In ancient Greece, there was a shepherd named Gyges, pronounced Gyges. One day while he was feeding his flock, a violent storm broke out and the earth cracked open. Gyges went down into the opening made by the earthquake and saw many unbelievable sights. One was a gigantic bronze horse with doors in it. Gyges looked inside one of the doors and saw a large dead body. The only thing it wore was a gold ring. Gyges took the ring and climbed back out of the opening in the earth. That night, Gyges met up with the other shepherds to work on the report that they had to submit to the king they worked for. They were talking in the king's audience room, and Gyges was fiddling with the ring. He turned it in a particular way and realized that he had suddenly become invisible. His fellow shepherds were startled and started talking about him as if he wasn't there. Needless to say, Gyges was amazed. He turned the ring the other way and instantly reappeared. In no time at all, he figured out how to make himself appear and vanish at will. And as soon as he was good at it, he came up with an evil scheme. He got himself invited to the king's court, made himself disappear, and seduced the queen. After a while, the queen conspired with Gyges to kill the king and take over the kingdom. What if this ring fell into the hands of someone who believed in justice and was just, who always did the right thing? Plato thought that such a person would do the wrong thing, just like Gyges. The temptation to steal, sneak around, sleep around, kill, or release prisoners from jail would be too great. This ring would confer so much power that people would behave like gods and do whatever they wanted, whether it was right or wrong. And so, with a ring like this, the actions of the just and the unjust would be identical. This test of character shows that it doesn't matter if a person wants to do the right thing, or if he or she thinks doing the right thing is best for him or her personally. Justice results from refusing to do the wrong thing, even if the person knows he or she can get away with it. The heart of unjust action is thinking that you can get away with something. And people believe in their hearts that injustice is more profitable than justice. In fact, if you were able to get a hold of this ring and never do any wrong, other people would think you an idiot. Why wouldn't you use such a ring to your advantage? Maybe you'd get praised in public, but behind your back, everyone would think you were a fool. People would keep up the hypocrisy of praising you in public and hiding their real opinion because otherwise they'd worry that the person with the ring would take advantage of them. They'd tell each other, if I had a ring of invisibility, I'd use it to do whatever I wanted, at least once. But they would be secretly afraid that someone with the ring would do the same to them. For Plato, then, discussions about justice are aided by an understanding of unjust acts. In order to understand the nature of justice, we must understand the nature of the unjust act. As everyone is capable of acting unjustly, we must be vigilant against doing so. Of course, in the real world, there is no ring. But the tale highlights the nature of the unjust act, as well as the fact that acting unjustly is possible for anyone. We are all capable of taking advantage of opportunities, even if taking advantage means acting unethically. It is false to believe that your actions are invisible to others. You may act as though they are, but in the end, you must recognize that your actions may be discovered. And if they are discovered, then you'll have to deal with the consequences of your actions. This might mean a loss of friendship, or in more serious circumstances, dealing with the criminal justice system. The risk of discovery is always there. Now that you have finished reading, you will be answering these questions in Student Resource 1.1. So Section 1, Plato and the Ring of Gyges. The first question, why should we be ethical if nobody knows what we are doing? The second question you'll be answering is, what does this story say about power? When you're typing in your responses or writing your responses, make sure that your responses meet or exceed the following assessment criteria. Your response should indicate a careful reading of the excerpt by citing part of it or referring to it. Your response should provide examples or reasoning according to the pertinent ethical theory. Your response should demonstrate an understanding of the differences between theories, and your response should be written in complete sentences using proper spelling, punctuation, and grammar. A little more information regarding Plato and the Ring of Gyges. The Ring of Gyges illustrates the difference between being motivated by self-interest and thereby sacrificing others if it benefits you, and being guided by other regarding motivation. The latter is key to moral action, the former to immoral action. Being ethical means following the rules of conduct whether anyone else notices or not. J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, studied the classics at Oxford University and knew the Ring of Gyges story well. His novels were inspired by the story. This story remains important to us today because it concerns what we can expect humans to do with power over others. In politics, we give power to others, hoping they will do what is right. But if Pluto's allegory is right, watch out. Anyone who gains power without accountability is liable to use it unjustly. Once you are finished with the first story, Plato and the Ring of Gyges, let us move on to Aristotle on the definition of human happiness and its relationship to virtue. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote a book called Nicomachean Ethics, books 1 and 2. The following passages are brief rewordings of excerpts from that book, from these works. A few notes on the words that Aristotle uses. In his time, virtue didn't mean the quality of being modest, prim and proper, which we associate with this term. In ancient Greece, virtue meant excellence. Also, the word mean does not mean average. It means the spot between two extremes. Here is how to measure the quality of a person's life. 1. The quality of a life is a matter of the person's skill and strength in practical reasoning and directing desires. 2. A person's actions must result from proper reasoning. 3. A good person engages in actions that are good and noble. 4. All activities are well executed and meet standards of excellence for those kinds of activities. A person is living a life of excellence, of qualities, if these characteristics are in place. This person may even lead a complete life, which is partly measured by how much happiness is experienced. One day does not make an entire season, and neither does one day of excellence or virtue make a whole life of virtue or excellence. A virtuous life lived over time leads to a life of virtue. Happiness is an activity of the soul that results from perfect virtue. So we need to look at what virtue really is, if it's the source of human happiness. Most people are searching for what is good, and everyone knows that leading a good life and happiness are related in some way. Otherwise, how could life be good without happiness? A mean is something that lies between two vices. On one side is excess, and on the other is not enough. For example, gluttony is eating too much, and starving is eating too little. If you are a glutton, you go way beyond what is right. And if you are starving, you have fallen short of what is right. A proper diet is the mean between too much and too little food. The same idea applies to emotion. Say too much anger on one hand and too little on the other. Virtue is in and of itself a mean. It means in the middle. So virtue is the thing to pursue the most if you want to be a virtuous person. But what about those that are wicked in nature, like malice, the intention to do evil, envy, adultery, theft, and murder? These are wicked, period. There is no too little or too much. It is not possible to be right in them. Anytime a person murders or commits adultery, it's always wrong. To understand how virtue theory plays out in our modern world, we must think about what makes our lives happy and how best to properly reason toward happiness. Modern virtue theorists believe that we must cultivate character traits or general dispositions toward attitudes and commitments that will best bring us a happy life. Unlike the next two theories we will look at, which gives us guidelines on how to act in particular circumstances, virtue theory focuses on the whole of one's life. If you want to act ethically, then become an ethical person. If you think honesty, for example, plays a role in being an ethical person, then become an honest person by telling the truth. Now that you have finished that story, you can answer these questions based on Aristotle and the definition of human happiness and its relationship to virtue. The first question is, what makes a character trait good or bad? You'll be writing your answers in that box. The second question, based on this reading and the class discussion, think of someone you know who feel leads a life of virtue. Describe this person's life. Why is it a life of virtue? Now think of someone who does not lead a virtuous life. What makes it not virtuous? Do not forget your assessment criteria. Make sure your responses meet or exceed the following assessment criteria. Your response needs to indicate a careful reading of the excerpt by citing part of it or referring to it. Your response has to provide examples or reasoning according to the pertinent ethical theory, which is about happiness and virtue. Your response should demonstrate an understanding of the differences between the theories. Your response has to be written in complete sentences using proper spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Sorry about that, the camera ran out of space on the last video, so I had to cut it off in the middle of going through, we were doing Aristotle, right? Yeah. So we're just going to continue from here. This is a direct continuation from where we just left off. Here are some extra notes regarding Aristotle on the definition of human happiness and its relationship to virtue. This passage summarizes what is known as virtue-based ethical thinking, or virtue ethics for short, which focuses on inner character traits rather than actions. It asks, what sort of person should I be, rather than what sorts of actions should I do? A virtue thinker believes that you can't do the right thing unless you have the right motivations. For example, say two people donate money to a good cause. One does it anonymously, and one wants the world to know who gave the money. The anonymous donor would be better because the motivation is to help others, not to be recognized as the benefactor. So one of the things we need to consider when looking at a situation and determining how to act is what that act would mean in terms of our character. Virtue ethics is based upon consideration of what effect the action has upon the agent's character. What about your thoughts? Do you think it is possible to separate the two? Do you think it's possible to identify character without actions? Do you agree that character is composed of the actions of one's life? An honest person is a person who acts honestly, for instance. Virtue as a synonym for excellence. Aristotle is saying that people need certain character traits to be excellent people. That characteristic brings us closer to the potentially perfect being we have within us is called a virtue. Characteristics that take us away from our perfect potential are called vices. Courage is a trait that enables us to be excellent in response to danger. And justice is the trait required to be excellent in deciding what people are entitled to, for instance. In the second paragraph of this section, Aristotle is saying that reason is the capacity that allows us to understand which emotions we should trust or follow and which ones we shouldn't. Aristotle connects being virtuous with happiness. In other words, his answer to the question, why be ethical, is that developing the virtues makes your own life better because virtues are the character traits you need to live a happy life. It takes a combination of reason and emotion to enable a person to attain the golden mean, the desirable middle between two extremes, and to develop true virtue. However, what constitutes good character for one person isn't always the same for someone else. For example, a 200-pound football player who breaks up a brawl is being courageous. A 120-pound woman attempting the same thing is being foolish. Once you have finished answering the questions relating to the Aristotle reading assignment, we will now move on to the third, which is John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. This section summarizes an excerpt from the book Utilitarianism by British philosopher John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism is based on the greatest happiness principle, in which actions are right based on how much happiness they create, and actions are wrong based upon the amount of unhappiness they produce. The definition of happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. The definition of unhappiness is pain and the absence of pleasure. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things we should desire as ends in themselves. Put another way, all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in them or as means to promote pleasure and prevent pain. Therefore, we should find ways to increase overall happiness and decrease overall pain. But isn't there a difference in the quality of pleasures? Isn't one more valuable than another? Wouldn't quality be worth more than quantity of pleasure? For example, requiring people to go to school is a superior pleasure, one of quality, superior to not attending school, which might result in a great quantity of temporary pleasure, but would also result in ignorance and its consequences. Such considerations also ensure that individuals do not give themselves preferential treatment in their calculation of what is best, which, according to utilitarianism, is something to avoid. The goal is to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number. An individual's happiness, your happiness, only counts for one. Unlike Aristotle's virtue ethics, utilitarianism is meant to guide individual action at the point where a decision must be made. It does not provide a guide for character over one's lifespan. According to utilitarianism, when faced with a dilemma and before taking action, you should consider what options are available and what the likely outcome for these options are and how much happiness and unhappiness might come from these options. As a calculation, you should create a ledger of happiness and unhappiness and calculate the projected results for each available option as it pertains to those people affected by your action. The option that has the highest happiness for the greatest number of people is the most ethical to choose. Utilitarianism is, therefore, an ethical theory based on the consequences of action. What drives an action to be the ethical one, or what determines an ethical choice, is the consequence or outcome of that action. The rightness of an action is determined by the amount of good it produces. So in your worksheets in front of you, you will answer these next two questions regarding John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. The first question: Mill thinks that happiness is something that is quantifiable or measurable. The greatest sum of the value of happiness for the greatest number of people tells you the right course of action, even if that course of action wouldn't make you happy. What is an example of how this principle would look in your own life? The next question: as a concept, is happiness subjective or objective? Are pleasure and freedom from pain the only things that we should consider, that we should desire as ends in themselves, as utilitarians say? Explain your reasoning. I'll read that again, I messed that up a little bit. As a concept, is happiness subjective or objective? Are pleasures and freedom from pain the only things that we should desire as ends in themselves, as utilitarians say? And explain your reasoning. So go ahead and answer those two questions. If you're in my classroom, you have these worksheets in front of you. Go ahead and answer those two questions. In the meantime, I'm going to discuss a little bit more information about John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. Unlike virtue-based thinking, which has been criticized for not offering enough guidance when an ethical choice is difficult, utilitarianism's answer is to do what will maximize overall happiness. The name of the theory comes from this idea, which is also known as the principle of utility. This theory focuses on outcomes of choices and actions, not on the inner character traits that produce them. In utilitarianism, it doesn't matter what your inner character traits are. All that matters is that you maximize pleasure and minimize pain for everyone affected, yourself included. The moral status of an action is determined by the results of that action. Since we change the world by acting or choosing not to act, our choices need to be guided by a desire to make this the best possible world for everyone. When Mill talks about happiness, he doesn't just mean our own. He means we should do the actions that promote the greatest happiness overall, including us, but you only count for one, just like everybody else. Utilitarianism is not the same as the principle of majority rule. Majority rule says to do what most of the people want, but what most people want won't necessarily make them happy in the long run. Nothing is totally forbidden in utilitarian morality. If it turned out that owning slaves maximized overall happiness, and that no other social organization created equal or greater amounts of happiness, then a utilitarian would have to say that owning slaves is the right thing to do. This is in contrast to virtue ethics from Aristotle and to the ethics of rights and duties from Kant. When you write your responses, make sure that your responses meet or exceed the following assessment criteria. The response indicates a careful reading of the excerpt by citing part of it or referring to it. The response provides examples or reasoning according to the pertinent ethical theory. The response demonstrates an understanding of the differences between theories. The response is written in complete sentences using proper spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Fourth and the last reading passage is Kant and the ethics of rights and duties. This passage summarizes an excerpt from the book Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. A note about how Kant uses the term universal law or perfect law. He means a principle that all human beings should act on in all situations all the time. For Kant, we should avoid looking at the consequences of an action and instead focus upon doing the right thing, where the right thing is rationally determined. We can derive from this some fairly robust rights and duties that cannot be derived in utilitarianism. For instance, where utilitarianism has an equal weight for everyone, rationality allows us to give preferential treatment for our loved ones. For Kant, we have added duties to those special relations, parents, children, or friends that we don't have to strangers. The moral worth of an action doesn't come from its effect, as utilitarianism claims, or from a principle stating that our motives are tied up in the effects of our actions. Something besides our own efforts can cause us to be happy, for example. Being happy is the effect, which doesn't have to be brought about by a rational being. It could be because of excellent weather for a long period of time, for example. The weather has an effect of creating a successful harvest so that there's plenty of food. Therefore, the highest good can only be found in a rational being. This kind of good does not change. Only a rational being can think about the law rationally and objectively. The perfect law that a rational being could create using flawless logic is based on principle and not on the effects the law would have. The good inside a person is a good that follows from this principle of perfect law. The good does not come from thinking about the results this law might have. What kind of law guides our will, where we make choices so that we don't expect a particular effect or result? Say you saw someone beside the road with a flat tire. What is better? Expecting to be paid back by the person before you even help? Or helping this person because it's the right thing to do? Here's the test for what could become universal or perfect law. Can I make my action universal? Say you want to steal something. Can you make this action universal? If stealing were allowed, everyone would do it, and nobody could own anything and nothing would be private. Ordinary reasoning brings this conclusion because it makes sense. What if you're stressed out and you make a promise you can't keep? Yeah, I'll make it to tomorrow's meeting, but you already know you won't go. You just say yes to avoid getting hassled about it. But can you know what the consequences will be of making a promise you are almost certain not to keep? People will lose confidence in you if you often make promises you don't keep. Worse, you will be seen as lacking integrity and truthfulness, and the fallout from the fallout for you from that will be huge. The better choice is to act in accordance with the principles above. Only do things that can be made universal, and develop a habit of not making promises you won't follow through on. What is the real driving force behind this universal principle? Is it duty or fear of consequences? If you follow the principle that your actions are okay if they can be made universal out of duty, then you are following the universal guide to proper decision making in ethics. If instead you are thinking about the effects of your actions, then you are trying to be smarter than you can ever be, and you are gambling with stakes bigger than you or other people. In this situation, people will get hurt. Breaking promises might be okay short term, but we all need friends we trust. Trust is built on honesty, and honesty is the bedrock of integrity. Lying cannot be made universal. If it were, there would be no truth, and no one could ever believe anything. What if someone said, "I am lying to you"? People who say they are lying have to be telling the truth about whether or not they are lying, otherwise, how would you know? Young people who don't have much experience yet can still use this principle of asking if something can be made universal. Even though many people have acted against this principle by stealing, lying, and cheating, more people don't. If everyone always stole, lied, and cheating, would there be any society where people trusted each other? If we never trusted each other, could we work cooperatively? Could we learn from each other, receive or give help? So duty comes from respect for this principle of universal law. It is also practical because it works. As for motives, what drives us to do one thing and not another? They also yield to this duty because it comes from a purely good will. According to Kant, the worth of this purely good will is higher than anything else. So your last set of questions relating to Kant, the ethics of rights and duties. The first question, Kant believes that there are certain things you must always do and certain things you must never do no matter what. For example, you should do your duty and you should never violate a person's rights. What would some of these always and never things be? Explain your answer. You will be writing down your answers in that box. The second one, Kant gives an example of the kind of law or principle that should guide our actions so that we don't expect a particular effect or result. What is better, helping someone while expecting to be paid back by that person, or helping someone because it's the right thing to do? Provide some examples of this kind of principle at work. You will be filling that in under that box. Don't forget the assessment criteria. This is a graded assignment. Your response should indicate a careful reading of the excerpt by citing part of it or referring to it. Your response should provide examples or reasoning according to the pertinent ethical theory. Your response should demonstrate an understanding of the differences between the theories. Your response must be written in complete sentences using proper spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Here are some extra notes regarding Kant and the ethics of rights and duties. Immanuel Kant gave us an ethical system in which there are absolute moral duties. An act is morally necessary if we have a duty to do it, and morally impermissible if we have a duty not to. There are absolute moral rules, and we need to follow them regardless of the situation. How to apply universal law. When deciding what to do, take the potential action and remove all of the context. Don't worry about who, where, when, or what would happen as a result. Nothing. Boil it down to the bare action itself and ask whether always do X or never do X should be the universal law. Once you've figured out which one should be the universal law, then it becomes universal, and you must follow it all the time. One criticism of this philosophy is that it does eliminate context. So lying to save someone, for instance, becomes impermissible because the universal law tells us that we should never lie. What is important for Kant is that a goodwill is entirely independent of the results of the action. One acts with a goodwill when someone wants to do the right thing solely because it's the right thing, regardless of the consequences of the action. So an action would not be good if it were motivated by fear of punishment or the pursuit of a pleasure. Lying is wrong because it is lying. One should tell the truth even if it hurts someone, because acting with a goodwill means telling the truth in order to do the right thing. Circumstances make no difference in the moral worth of an action. Once you have finished writing in your responses for all of those four reading prompts, let us look into this following ethical dilemma. The region around San Francisco, California has some of the highest home prices in America. Many middle-income families cannot afford to buy a house at all, or they have to buy one many miles away from their workplace. But an exclusive group of elite executives, for example, city managers and school superintendents, are using public funds to get low interest or no interest loans to buy houses. A local newspaper brought this situation into the public eye. Taxpayers were not aware that their taxes were helping people with high incomes buy million-dollar houses, but the practice is legal. Answer these questions so we can have a brief class discussion. What is wrong in this situation? Would you say that the people receiving the loans are getting away with something? Why or why not? What if the public never learned about this practice? Would your opinions change? Keep thinking about this ethical dilemma because it will be relevant to what you will learn next. If you are in my class, you have this assignment to do next, where you will actually be answering those three questions. For example, the first one is what is wrong in this situation? The second one is would you say that people receiving the loans are getting away with something? And the third question about whether or not, if it was not in the public eye, would your opinions change? Discussion. Applying ethical concepts to current ethical dilemmas. You will strengthen your understanding of key ethical concepts by applying them to current ethical dilemmas, both public and personal. For this activity, you must work in pairs. Recall the dilemma about housing in San Francisco. Work in pairs to discuss the following question. How does the Ring of Gyges story relate to this dilemma? Once again, if you have my class, the next page, you will actually answer this and you will work together with your partner in pairs and write your responses down on this sheet. How does the Ring of Gyges story relate to this dilemma regarding San Francisco housing? There are no right or wrong answers, but you should see that the newspaper story exemplifies what Plato thinks people will do given power and lack of accountability. Now, I will give you an opportunity to apply the ethical theories you have learned to the practice of telling white lies. Remember what a white lie is: a minor lie that is often told to avoid hurting someone's feelings. In pairs, discuss your thoughts on the following. Be sure to take down notes on your thoughts. What would a virtue ethicist say about telling white lies? What would a utilitarian say about telling white lies? What would Kant say about telling white lies? If you have class with me, then you have this worksheet to fill out. You're still working in your pairs. You will discuss and write down your thoughts on the following 3 questions. What would a virtue ethicist say about telling white lies? What would a utilitarian say about telling white lies? And third is, what would Kant say about telling white lies? Now that you've had a chance to consider and take notes on these questions, let's chat for a bit. You should recognize the following. A virtue ethicist would allow for white lies because people tell them in order to avoid hurting others' feelings, and compassion is a character trait that we all need. A utilitarian would allow a white lie because a small lie might result in more happiness for more people than the truth would, and would have little or no risk of harm. Lying for personal gain is, of course, wrong, however. Kant would not allow for white lies. He'd say they may pave the road for telling not so white lies, such as lying for personal gain, and these lies will have a bad effect on our character. He would also say that a white lie does not pass the universalizable law test. Taxonomy, general course terms. You are going to develop a taxonomy of ethics terms to further consolidate your familiarity with new vocabulary. Look at Student Resource 1.3, Taxonomy, Professional Ethics Terms. On your own, begin by thinking of terms that relate to ethics. An example is the term ethics. You can write the word ethics next to the letter E. Work on this, adding as many terms as you can think of that relate directly to ethics. You may write more than one term for each letter. However, you should not worry about finding a term for each letter. And if you're in my class, or any class actually, any NAF professional ethics course, you should have this Student Resource 1.3 in front of you, and you will be putting in the terms in alphabetical order related to the concept of ethics. Okay, so for this next part, you will have to work in pairs. Collaborate with your partner by sharing terms in order to build their taxonomies. For example, if one student has written virtue and the other has not, the second student would add virtue to his or her taxonomy. So work in pairs and share which items you may have that your partner may not have, or vice versa. Items that are terms that your partner has that you do not have. Once you are done with that, from now on, you will be in charge of remembering to add resources to your notebook. and to keep the table of contents up to date. Continue to add relevant vocabulary terms that you encounter. This taxonomy should become a solid list of basic terminology that will serve as a resource for future assignments. Adding to the taxonomy will not be explicitly suggested in future lessons, so you need to remember to add to your own taxonomy on your own. Video. Interviews with people in different professions. You will now be able to see that the ethical theories you have just learned are relevant to ethical decision making for people either studying for a particular career or working in their chosen field. Explain what you would do, what you would decide to do if you had the Ring of Gyges, and why. So, if you're in my class, you have this worksheet in front of you where you'll actually answer both parts separately. Explain what you would do if you had the Ring of Gyges and why. So the first part is what you would decide to do, and the second part is why you would decide to do it. Before I play this video, be prepared to write down the following: the profession or the major of the person being interviewed, the ethical theory that person feels aligned with, and what that person would do if he or she got a hold of the Ring of Gyges. Before starting the video, I must note that deontology is the term used for the ethical philosophy of Kant. You will hear the term in this video. And here is that video.
The Ring of Gyges is a mythical and powerful artifact spoken of by Plato in Book 2 of his Republic, written around 375 BC. In the Republic, Plato's older brother Glaucon tells us of a lowly shepherd named Gyges, who lived in the 7th century BC in the kingdom of Lydia, which was located in Asia Minor, south of the Black Sea, where the country of Turkey stands today. According to Glaucon, following an almighty earthquake, a fissure was opened up in the earth, which revealed to Gyges a hidden cave. Inside the cave, Gyges found a large bronze tomb, fashioned into the shape of a horse, and inside the tomb lay the body of a being described as larger than any human. This being was entirely unadorned, save for a single golden ring on one of its fingers, which Gyges took for himself. It was not long after, however, before Gyges realized that this was no ordinary ring, for just by turning the collet at the top, the ring gave Gyges the power to become completely invisible. Armed with this extraordinary power, the lowly shepherd Gyges stole into the royal castle and seduced the queen, murdered the king, and usurped his throne to become ruler of the kingdom of Lydia himself. For Plato, the point of this story was to illustrate that the only thing that keeps people from acting immorally is the fear of getting caught. Indeed, given the power to become completely invisible, to act without fear of punishment, then according to Plato, no person can be imagined to be of such iron nature as to stand fast in justice. Plato's idea that people act morally not due to choice, but rather out of necessity, went on to influence many philosophers, including the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who believed that the natural state of mankind is to be violent and barbarous, and that without the imposition of society and law to keep us in check, the lives of men would be, as he famously put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In addition to contributing to our moral and political philosophy, the fable of the Ring of Gyges has also found its way into our popular culture, with books like H.G. Wells' Invisible Man and of course J.R.R. Tolkien's One Ring to Rule Them All, featured in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And although the allegory of the Ring of Gyges is more than 2,000 years old, it arguably would appear to be more relevant today than ever before. Firstly, in modern times, millions of people interact online anonymously, almost as if they were invisible, and this has arguably exacerbated various injustices, such as trolling, online fraud, and cyberbullying. Secondly, owing to the vast size of our population, individual relationships, be they personal or professional, have diminished in value and have almost become disposable. Consequently, rather than taking responsibility for our actions and seeking to change ourselves, today it is far easier to slip invisibly through the cracks in society and simply change our job or social circle. And finally, with news media cycles transitioning at such a fast pace, and with our attention spans getting shorter by the day, the rich and powerful in society are able to act with relative impunity, as they know that nothing they do, no matter how scandalous, will remain visible to the public long enough for them to face any significant repercussions. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and until next time, thanks for watching.
Welcome back. Let's move on. So to conclude this lesson, just know that you're going to delve much more deeply into ethics and professionalism. And that is it for lesson 1 of professional ethics. If you've made it to this point, we are completely done with the first lesson of the first unit of professional ethics. Remember that there are 12 units in total, so we will do this entire thing 11 more times. But for now, make sure you are finished. When you are finished with everything, you will be submitting everything we've done so far. If you're in my class, at least you'll be submitting everything we've done so far for a grade before we move on to lesson number 2. So that's it for lesson number 1 of NAF, professional ethics. Hope you were able to keep up. If there are any things that you missed or you're not sure of, be sure to rewind and rewatch those sections. Make sure you understand everything that we have discussed in this lesson before we move on to the next lesson. Okay? That's it for this video. See you in lesson 2.